There is a moment, just as the tide begins to fall, when the veil exhales. The black glass surface of the sea draws down like a held breath released, and for the span of 200 heartbeats, the spire tops of Itheria break the air for the first time since their god was silenced. The fishermen call this the tide window. The pearl divers call it their paycheck. Kaelen called it the only honest door he had ever walked through. He had been diving the wrecks of the Veil for 11 years, 342 descents into the drowned city, harvesting the pearls that grew on the chandeliers of sunken chapels, the scallop shell basins of abandoned fonts, the altar rails where priests had once knelt in incense and gold. The pearls of Itheria had a color no other sea could produce, a deep, luminous lilac that seemed to hold starlight inside it. Wealthy collectors in the coastal cities paid fortunes for a single Etherian pearl, and so Kaelen dove. But this tide window was different. He knew it before his boat anchored above the bell tower. The water felt heavier, the gulls refused to fly over the spot, and when he slipped over the gunwale and plunged into the green-black depths, he heard something he had never heard in 11 years of diving. Somewhere below in the drowned cathedral, someone was singing. The singing grew clearer as he kicked deeper through the submerged nave. It was not a voice, not exactly. It was a sound that moved through his teeth and vibrated in his sternum, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the stone itself. Kaelen drew his diving knife and pushed through the cloud of silt that had risen from the fallen archway. And then he saw the priest, sitting upright against the coral-throated pulpit, his legs crossed at the ankle, his hands folded over a scroll sealed in black wax. His vestments moved slowly in the current, the gold thread catching faint light. But it was his face that stopped Kaelen cold. The eye sockets were not empty. They glittered. 2 abalone pearls, shot through with iridescent green and blue, had grown where the priest's eyes had been. The drowned man was not dead. He was preserved for something. Kaelen reached for the scroll. The singing grew louder. The water around the priest's mouth shimmered with each note, tiny bubbles escaping parted lips that should have rotted away centuries ago. Kaelen pulled the scroll free, kicked off the altar step, and ascended toward the light. Behind him the singing did not stop. It followed him up through the bell tower, through the tide window, into the cold air of the living world. On the boat, with the tide window closing and the sea rising around his anchor line, Kaelen broke the seal. The parchment was dry. Impossible, he would later think, dry after 3 centuries underwater. But he did not think it then. He simply unrolled it and read. The script was not written in any tongue he knew, and yet the words moved through him as if translated by the blood itself. He read aloud because the words demanded a voice. His throat vibrated with a resonance not his own. "Blessed be the deep that holds us," he read, and the wind stopped. "Blessed be the salt that preserves us." The lantern flame flattened. "Blessed be the silence that became a door." When he finished, the scroll crumbled to wet pulp in his hands. But the words did not leave him. They had taken root in his throat, behind his teeth, in the hollow spaces of his chest. He tried to cough them out. He tried to clear his throat, but every breath he took tasted of brine, and when he looked over the gunwale at his reflection in the black water, his reflection was still reading. The tide witch lived at the edge of the salt marshes, in a hut whose floorboards were warped by centuries of spray. Her name was Morwen, and she was the only person Kaelen knew who had entered Itheria and returned with both her mind and her silence intact. Morwen did not speak of what she had seen in the drowned city, but he knew she knew, because every year on the same night, she left a bowl of salt water on her windowsill and sat watching it until dawn. "You read it," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was dry as driftwood. Kaelen nodded. "I read it aloud." Morwen closed her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was different, deeper, as if someone else spoke through her mouth. "The sermon is not words, boy. It is a call. The drowned god did not fall silent 3 centuries ago. It has been waiting, singing, sending its hymn up through the fathoms year after year, looking for a voice that could carry it back into the air. It found you." Kalen's hand went to his throat. The hymn was there, coiled behind his larynx, waiting for the next word. He could feel the shape of it, vast, ancient, patient. It knew his ribs. It knew the rhythm of his heart. "What happens if I sing it?" he asked. Morwen pushed the bowl of salt water toward him. "You already know." Kaelen looked down. The water in the bowl was not still. It was moving in counterpoint to something, to the silent song inside him. He felt his feet pressing against the floorboards, felt the direction they wanted to carry him. Back to the shore, back to the vale, back to the place where the water was deepest and the singing never stopped. He returned to the vale at dawn of the next tide window. He did not bring his boat. He did not bring his knife or his collecting bag. He wore his oldest clothes, a wool coat that had belonged to his father, boots that had walked 100 coastal roads. He stood at the water's edge as the sea drew back, revealing the dark spires of Itheria rising like fingers from a grave. The hymn was louder now. It was not in his throat anymore. It filled his lungs. It occupied the chambers of his heart. He could hear the separate notes, the bass of the abyss, the tenor of the drowned choir, the descant of the priest whose scroll he had taken. They were singing for him. They had been singing for him since the moment he was born, and he had only just now learned to listen. He stepped into the water. It was warmer than the air, the temperature of blood. The black surface parted around his knees, his waist, his chest. He did not hesitate. The tide window would close in 100 heartbeats, and if he was not below by then, he would have to wait another day. But there was no question of waiting. The sermon would not allow it. The water rose to his chin. He took one last breath of cold air, the air of the world above, of morning wind and salt spray and the cry of distant gulls. And then he let it out. Beneath the surface, the cathedral of Itheria was burning with light. Bioluminescence streamed from every window, every shattered rose window, every archway draped in kelp. The congregation waited in the nave, 100 figures in silt-encrusted vestments, their eye sockets filled with iridescent pearl. At the altar, standing where the high priest had stood 3 centuries ago, was a figure made of darkness and phosphorescence. The drowned god. It had no face. It did not need one. Kaelen swam toward it. His lungs did not burn. The water in his chest was not water. It was the hymn itself, and it had been waiting for him. He opened his mouth, and for the first time, he sang. His voice joined the ancient chorus, and the cathedral trembled. The bells of Itheria, silent for 300 years, stirred in their moorings. One by one, they began to toll. The sound rose through the abyss, through the tide window, through the cold morning air, carrying the sermon to the coast where the fishermen paused, where the gulls fell silent, where the tide witch Morwen set down her bowl of salt water and smiled. Somewhere in the drowned city, a new pearl had begun to form. Not on an altar or a chandelier, but in the chest of a man who had finally answered the question he had been carrying since birth. Not why the god fell silent, but who it had been waiting for. The veil closed over the spire tops. The sea was still. And if you stand at the shore on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind comes from the east, you can hear it. A hymn drifting up from the deep. It is older than any language. It has no beginning and no end. And somewhere in the black heart of Itheria, a new voice sings with the congregation. It sounds like a man who has finally found the only words he was ever meant to speak.